Why do humans become awkward? If we go back even just 50 years, the notion of awkwardness didn't really exist, or at least not by that name. Sure, there was etiquette, a set of rules for social conduct, but largely people didn't really obsess over social faux pas. Nowadays, awkward has become its own culture, with cringe comedy and certain internet memes, such as "that awkward moment when," at the forefront. Rather than comparing social situations on an ethical basis, we instead think of them in terms of the grace with which the act is carried out. The emphasis has changed from, am I doing the right thing, to, am I doing this the right way? It's as though methodologies, not results, are what matters. We become so vehemently opposed to making waves that it acts to our detriment. But before we dig too far into this topic, we should distinguish between two types of awkwardness, and why, from an evolutionary standpoint, they exist. The first type of awkwardness is simply feeling awkward. Awkwardness can be categorized as a self-conscious emotion, but what does this term mean psychoanalytically? Self-conscious emotions include guilt, shame, pride, jealousy, and embarrassment. One way to think of self-conscious emotions is that they can arise from some internal stimulus, that there's no guaranteed external stimulus that can be applied to a person to generate these emotions. What we mean is, what causes shame in one person might not cause shame in another, implying some subjectivity in expression. Of course, you could find similar cases for all emotions, but it's especially true for these self-conscious emotions. One explanation for this subjectivity is the idea of standards, rules, and goals, also known as SRGs. Freud would describe SRGs as the superego, the part of a person's mind that acts as a self-critical conscience, reflecting social standards learnt from authority figures, typically associated with the father. A confliction between an individual's SRGs and the situation they're in can generate self-conscious emotions. But let's take a step back for a moment. Some self-conscious emotions don't even require SRGs, merely an awareness of self. Lewis puts forth the idea of me, of knowing that you can be the object of someone else's attention. Studies show that this self-reflective attitude develops around the age of 15 to 24 months, coinciding with the development of emotions such as embarrassment, jealousy, and empathy. This makes sense, since once you begin to understand that others perceive you, you also realize that they are aware of you perceiving them. Okay, that was confusing. Feel free to take some time and figure out what I mean. The point is that we can now think beyond ourselves, to rationalize how others might feel based on how we feel, given certain stimuli, to put ourselves in their shoes. Lewis goes on to describe how, in our third year of life, we incorporate consideration of SRGs into our actions. We become self-evaluating. This leads to more complex emotions, such as guilt, shame, and pride. The common theme here is that we feel bad or good based on whether we think others would approve of our actions. But there's a catch in that sentence. We have to think that they're our actions, to take responsibility. For example, let's say you fail a test and your parents are punishing you for it. If you know that you failed because you never paid attention in class, never did the homework, etc., then you may feel shame. But if you blame your failing grade on the teacher's incompetence, then you bypass the self-evaluation and probably won't give the issue a second thought. I could go on about this for ages, but honestly there's just not enough time in this video. If you're interested, try reading through Michael Lewis's papers on the subject. They're well worth your time. But for now I want to finally get to the point of this whole explanation and focus in on one emotion in particular: embarrassment. Embarrassment is interesting when compared to the other emotions we've listed, since it can occur in a non-evaluative and an evaluative sense. Non-evaluative embarrassment occurs simply when attention is drawn to you. Darwin observed blushing in animals occurring due to the release of adrenaline, a hormone typically associated with the fight or flight response. This would seem to suggest that we take judgment of our actions as a threat, and our bodies respond accordingly. But studies have shown that embarrassment isn't dependent on a negative judgment from onlookers. In fact, compliments or flirting are just as likely to cause us to blush. Research goes as far as to prove that when we observe someone being embarrassed, we tend to like them more, due to a release of oxytocin, also known as the love hormone, in our brain. You could speculate that this is due to the person appearing more vulnerable, more human, and hence more attuned to social interactions. So feeling embarrassed when someone says, for example, that you're attractive only makes you more attractive, creating some kind of positive feedback loop. So what about evaluative embarrassment then? This ties back into a breaking of social norms, usually accidentally. Feeling embarrassment in this sense helps to maintain social order by telling others that you recognize that you've made a mistake and will endeavor to fix your behavior in the future. This is the sort of embarrassment that is more akin to shame, but in a less intense form. And from here, we finally have a jumping off point to talk about the titular emotion: awkwardness. If embarrassment is a less severe form of shame, then we can similarly consider awkwardness as a less severe form of embarrassment. One could think of awkwardness as a harmless confliction of social expectations, a disagreement in SRGs. Awkwardness differs from embarrassment, however, in that it can occur entirely on purpose as well as by accident. No one ever sets out to embarrass themselves, in an evaluative sense, since that would be a contradiction to the very definition, realizing that you've made a mistake. However, let's say you have a kid and you need to talk to them about sex. It may seem uncomfortable, but you know that in the long term they'll benefit from that knowledge. You go into that conversation knowing that it's going to be awkward. Another example would be having to talk to someone who you don't know very well. You'd be perfectly justified in feeling awkward, since you don't know what their SRGs are, and therefore aren't sure what to talk about. This is why small talk was invented, because you need safe topics such as weather and sports, which you can almost guarantee won't cause a confliction. Of course, awkwardness can also be accidental, like when you make a joke at someone's expense without realizing that they're standing right behind you. Or, say, you see someone wave at you, so you wave back, except it turns out that they were waving at someone else. So what's the key difference between embarrassment and awkwardness? I'd say it's a case of semantics, though generally embarrassment is a more intense emotion. Are you taking all of this in? There is one more way to feel awkward, and that's to empathize with someone who has just done something awkward. More commonly, we might call this cringing. Whilst feeling awkward or embarrassed cues us that what we have done is socially wrong, cringing does the same but for other people's actions. Cringe comedy relies on this empathy, forcing their protagonists to consistently participate in awkward interactions. For example, if you watch someone sing poorly on stage, you might cringe at their performance. You might feel even worse if they think that their singing is good. This ties in nicely to our second type of awkwardness, being awkward. Typically, someone you might describe as awkward is completely unaware. They may be so self-centered that they haven't picked up the signals from other people that they feel uncomfortable. You know the kind of person I mean. They make weird jokes at inappropriate times, they interrupt conversations with trivial nonsense, and they get mad about inconsequential things. Basically, they're douchebags. But these aren't the people I want to talk about, because they have the ability to interpret social cues, they just choose not to. I'm talking about people with diagnosable disorders, who literally can't read facial expressions or body language. When I mentioned social disorders, your first thought was probably autism. Autism is considered to be the most debilitating social disorder, since children with autism typically struggle to express emotions, cannot understand facial or body cues, and have obsessive-compulsive tendencies. For example, they must keep things in specific places, and they perform repetitive movements. However, many other disorders do exist. Asperger's is, simply put, considered a less severe form of autism due to its similarities in social disability. However, there are some key distinctions. For example, people with Asperger's often have higher than average IQ and develop fascinations with one particular topic, for example, trains, space, dinosaurs, etc. Socio-emotional processing disorder, or SEPD, is characterized by an abnormal dominant side of the brain. The non-dominant side of the brain handles non-verbal communication, whereas the dominant side handles verbal communication. Even more peculiar is the fact that people with SEPD often have better developed dominant sides than non-SEPD people. This means that they interpret emotion through tone of voice better than most people, but are unable to understand physical indicators of emotion. So what makes these people seem awkward? Well, the answer is simple. Since they can't interpret emotions, they're unable to evaluate SRGs. As explained previously, when we don't know someone's SRGs, it can feel awkward to talk to them. Thankfully, awareness of these disorders as real physiochemical differences has allowed for an open discussion and approach to treating these conditions. There are many ways to bridge the gap between socially able and socially disabled people. We just have to learn to meet each other halfway. So now we've seen why people become awkward from a few standpoints: social psychology, physiology of the mind, and evolutionary advantage. But one thing is still bugging me. Why are we so obsessed with awkwardness nowadays? Using Google's Ngram viewer shows us that our usage of the words awkward and awkwardness and the phrase awkward moment have begun to skyrocket since the year 2000. And Google's Ngram viewer only goes as far as 2008. But let's be honest, I didn't even have to look up word usage. Here's a fun drinking game. Scroll down your Facebook news feeds and take a shot every time you see the word awkward. It's absurd. But I have a couple of theories as to why this new millennia is so awkward. The first theory being the word itself. Let's face it, the word awkward looks awkward and is awkward to say. I ought to know, I've written it and said it 40 times in this script alone. The technical term for this phenomenon is an autological word, a word that expresses the property it describes. For example, pentasyllabic has 5 syllables and noun is a noun. Why am I bringing this up all of a sudden? Because, personally, I think the way the word looks is pleasing. I'm not crazy here. We gravitate towards things that are pleasant to the eye, so why should words be any different? We often use awkward when words such as embarrassing, uncomfortable, odd, confusing, or upsetting would more accurately describe the situation. Okay, so that's a pretty tenuous argument, but how about this for an explanation? Globalization. As the internet reaches more people, and it becomes progressively easier for us to chat to anyone around the world, the number of interactions in our daily life increases. This means dealing with more people we don't know, and, hence, more people whose SRGs we don't understand. Furthermore, different cultures have entirely different perceptions of what is socially appropriate. When you jump onto the internet, chances are you're speaking to someone who has radically different views than you on what is awkward. But really, the whole sensationalism is without basis. Awkwardness isn't a bad thing. Maybe at the time it can seem bad, but we learn, adapt, and laugh at these types of situations later on. As long as we are not paralyzed by a fear of being awkward. As long as we are willing to learn about other people's ideas of social normality and compromise with them, these so-called awkward moments needn't be so awkward.
Follow CultureCrash on social media!